Lieutenant Daniel Carter had seen many strange things during his 5 years aboard the exploration vessel Wanderer, but nothing prepared him for the sight of two towering figures emerging from the crimson mists of planet Korvax. 7. The beings stood, at least 12 feet tall, and their bronze skin gleamed under the alien sun, and they wore intricate leather garments decorated with turquoise and coral beads, and their long black hair was woven into elaborate braids. And what struck Daniel most was how human they appeared despite their enormous size, and their features were distinctly feminine, with high cheekbones and piercing dark eyes that seemed to assess him with both caution and curiosity. The Wanderer had crashed 3 days ago during a catastrophic ion storm, and Daniel was the only survivor, and his emergency supplies were running dangerously low, and he had been foraging near the wreckage when the two giants appeared and they blocked his path back to the ship. They spoke in a language that sounded like a mixture of rhythmic chanting and melodic tones, and the universal translator in his helmet struggled to process it, and it offered only fragments, like stranger and small, and lost. Daniel raised his hands slowly with palms outward in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace, and the taller of the two women tilted her head, and she studied him with an expression that reminded him of his sister back on Earth when she found a lost puppy. The shorter one, though, still towering over him, knelt down to his level, and she pointed at herself and said something that sounded like Nalinai, and then she gestured to her companion and said, "What might have been?" Kiona Daniel touched his chest and spoke clearly, saying, "My name is Daniel Carter." Nalinai repeated his name, though it came out sounding more like Danielle, and Kiona laughed with a sound like wind chimes, and she said something that made Nalinai swat her arm playfully. The translator suddenly crackled to life with better clarity, saying, "He is very small, and is he a child?" Daniel resisted the urge to feel offended because to them he supposed he was quite small, and he shook his head vigorously and tried to pantomime that he was an adult of his species. Both women seemed fascinated, and they circled him slowly, and occasionally reached out to touch his pressure suit with gentle, careful fingers, and Daniel noticed their hands were calloused and strong, like the hands of warriors or hunters. Kiona suddenly pointed at the sun, which was beginning to set, and it painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, and she made a gesture that seemed to indicate sleeping, and then pointed toward a distant mountain range where Daniel could see smoke rising from what might be campfires or settlements. Nalinai nodded enthusiastically and beckoned for him to follow. Daniel hesitated because his training told him to be cautious and to maintain distance from unknown alien species, but his survival instincts told him something different, and he was alone and injured and running out of supplies, and these beings seemed curious rather than hostile, and the prospect of shelter was tempting. He made his decision and nodded and took a step toward them. Both women seemed pleased, and Kiona reached down as if to pick him up, but Daniel quickly stepped back and shook his head, because he had some dignity left, and he could walk on his own. This seemed to amuse them greatly, and they began walking at a slow pace, and clearly adjusted their stride to accommodate his much shorter legs, and as they traveled, Daniel observed them more closely, and they moved with practiced grace, and their feet barely made a sound despite their size, and they carried what appeared to be hunting tools, including bows nearly as tall as Daniel himself, and quivers full of arrows and knives that could easily serve as swords in his hands. The journey took nearly an hour, and Daniel's legs were aching by the time they reached the base of the mountains, and what he saw there made him stop in his tracks. A village sprawled before him, and it was built into the mountainside itself, and the structures were a blend of natural cave formations and constructed dwellings made from adobe-like material and wooden beams, and smoke rose from several fire pits, and the smell of cooking meat made Daniel's stomach growl audibly. Dozens of the giant people were going about their evening activities, and children, though still taller than Daniel, played near the fires, while adults worked on various tasks like preparing food and repairing tools and weaving cloth, and everyone stopped what they were doing when they noticed him. A hush fell over the village, and Daniel felt dozens of eyes upon him, and his hand instinctively moved toward the plasma pistol on his hip, though he knew it would be useless against so many. Nalinai said something in a loud, clear voice, and the tension seemed to ease slightly, and people began to murmur among themselves, and they pointed and stared but did not approach. An elderly woman with hair streaked with silver emerged from one of the larger dwellings, and she walked with a carved wooden staff, and the way people moved aside for her told Daniel She held significant authority. She spoke to Nalanai and Kiona in sharp questioning tones, and the sisters responded respectfully, and they gestured toward Daniel and then toward the direction from which they had come, and the elder woman's eyes narrowed as she studied him. Finally, she approached Daniel directly and spoke, and the translator worked better. Now, perhaps having learned more of the language, and it said, "You are far from your sky vessel, small stranger. And are you a scout for an invasion?" Forced Daniel's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady and said, "No, ma'am, and I'm alone, and my ship crashed, and my crew is dead, and I mean no harm to your people." The translator converted his words, and he could only hope it did so accurately. The elder woman considered this for a long moment, and then she looked at Nalinai and Kiona and asked something that made both sisters look slightly embarrassed. The translator caught it, saying, "Did you feed him?" Both sisters shook their heads. The elder woman sighed deeply, which was a very human gesture that somehow made Daniel feel more at ease, and she said something that sounded like a reprimand, and then gestured toward one of the fire pits. The translator rendered her words, saying, "A guest even. A strange one should not go hungry, and you will eat with us, Daniel Carter, and then we will decide what to do with you." It was not exactly a warm welcome, but it was not a death sentence either, and Daniel nodded gratefully and followed the elder woman with Nalinai and Kiona trailing behind toward the warmth of the communal fires. The communal area was a wide circle of packed earth surrounded by smooth stones that served as seats, and 3 large fire pits blazed with orange flames, and over each hung massive clay pots that bubbled with stew, and the aroma was intoxicating. With roasted meat and herbs Daniel didn't recognize, and something that smelled almost like wild onions. The elder woman, whom others called Ayita, directed Daniel to sit on one of the stones, and it was far too large for him, so he perched on the edge, with his feet dangling well above the ground, and this drew some quiet laughter from the watching children, but it seemed good-natured rather than mocking. Nalinai and Kiona sat on either side of him like protective barriers against the curious crowd that was forming, and Daniel noticed that while people were fascinated by his presence, they maintained a respectful distance. A younger woman brought over a wooden bowl and ladle, and she served Ayita first, and then moved to Daniel, and the bowl she handed him was enormous and more like a serving tureen by his standards, and the ladle alone could have served as a soup pot. And Daniel looked at the portion she had given him and realized it could feed him for 3 days. He looked up at the server and smiled, saying, "Thank you, but this is too much." And maybe half the translator conveyed his words, and the woman looked confused, and she glanced at Ayita, who observed the exchange with interest. Ayita asked with her tone suggesting this was somehow offensive, saying, "You refuse food." Daniel said quickly, saying, No, and I'm grateful, but I'm much smaller than you, and I can't eat this much, and I don't want to waste what you've prepared." Understanding dawned on several faces, and the server nodded, and took back the bowl and returned a moment later with a smaller vessel, though it was still quite large by Daniel's standards, and he accepted it with a grateful nod. The stew was delicious, and the meat was tender and gamey, similar to venison, and the broth was rich with herbs and root vegetables, and Daniel ate slowly and savored each bite while Nalinai and Kiona watched him with barely concealed amusement. Nalinai observed through the translator, saying, "You eat very carefully and like a bird." Daniel replied with a grin, saying, "Small bites for a small person." Kiona laughed at that, and she was. Daniel was learning the more outgoing of the 2 sisters, and Nalinai seemed more serious and thoughtful as they ate. More people gathered around, though they maintained a respectful semicircle, and children whispered to their parents and pointed at Daniel's suit and his helmet, which he had removed and set beside him, and his unusual proportions. One brave child, who was a girl who still stood, about 7 feet tall despite being perhaps 8 years old, crept forward, and she reached out a finger toward Daniel's hand. Her mother called out sharply, but Daniel smiled and extended his hand to the child, saying softly that it's okay. The girl touched his hand gently, and her eyes widened at the difference in size, and her single finger was nearly as long as his entire hand. And she said something that the translator caught as so tiny, with a tone of wonder. Other children began to edge forward, and soon Daniel found himself surrounded by young ones, and all wanted to see the strange small visitor, and their parents watched nervously. But Daniel remained calm and friendly, and answered their questions as best he could through the translator. A boy asked, "Where do you come from?" Daniel answered, saying, "Very far away, in a place called Earth beyond the stars." Another child asked, "Are all your people this small?" He replied, saying, "Yes, and we're all about this size." Another asked, "Can you jump high?" Daniel stood on the stone seat and gave a small hop, and the children gasped and clapped and clearly delighted. He said with a laugh, saying, "Not as high as you can, I bet." One of the boys demonstrated by leaping nearly 4 feet straight up, from a standing position, and Daniel applauded and genuinely impressed. Aita watched this interaction carefully, and when the children finally dispersed at their parents' urging, she spoke to Daniel again. She observed, saying, "You are not afraid of us?" Daniel asked honestly, saying, "Should I be?" She said, "Many would be, and we are large and strange to you. Yet you sit among our children as if it were nothing." Daniel considered his words carefully, saying, "My people have a saying which is judge others by their actions, not their appearance, and you've given me food and shelter when you could have driven me away. And your children are curious and kind, and why should I be afraid?" Aita nodded slowly and seemed to approve of this answer, saying, "You are wise for one so small, but you have not yet met our chief, and he will want to question you tomorrow." Daniel said, "I understand, and I'm grateful for the chance to explain myself." As the evening wore on, people began to drift away to their homes, and Nalinai and Kiona remained with Daniel, and when the fires began to burn low, they led him to a small dwelling near the edge of the village. Nalinai explained, saying, "You can sleep here tonight, and this is a guest shelter, and it is humble but warm." The shelter was indeed small by their standards and perhaps 10 feet square, but it seemed palatial to Daniel, and a pile of furs in the corner would serve as a bed, and a small fire pit in the center provided warmth and light. Daniel said sincerely, saying, "This is perfect, and thank you both for everything." Kiona smiled broadly, saying, "You are a strange visitor, Danielle, but an interesting one, and sleep well, and tomorrow will be an important day." They left him then, and Daniel secured the hide door behind them, and he activated his suit's medical scanner and checked his vital signs, and everything seemed normal, though he was exhausted, as he settled into the pile of furs, which were surprisingly soft and warm. Daniel thought about the day's events, and he had expected many possible outcomes when he survived the crash, but this had not been one of them. These people, despite their intimidating size, seemed peaceful, and they valued hospitality and community, and they were curious rather than hostile, and he was alive and fed and sheltered, and tomorrow he would face their chief, and his fate would be decided. But tonight, for the first time since the crash, Daniel Carter felt a small spark of hope. Daniel woke to sunlight streaming through gaps in the hide door, and his body ached from sleeping on the ground. But the furs had kept him warm through the cold night, and he checked his suit's chronometer, and he had slept for nearly 10 hours, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep since the crash. He was halfway through a ration bar when he heard voices outside, and before he could respond, the door covering was pushed aside, and Nalinai entered while ducking to fit through the opening, and she carried a large clay jug and a wooden bowl. She said with her pronunciation of his name improving, saying, "Good morning, Dan. Yell and I brought you water and some morning bread." The bread turned out to be a flatbread similar to pita and warm and slightly sweet, and Daniel accepted it gratefully and realized his ration bars were a poor substitute for real food. He said, "Thank you, and you didn't have to bring this." Nalinai sat down cross-legged, which still put her head well above his. "And she," said Kiona, "and I spoke last night, and we realized we found you but did not truly help you, and we should have offered you food immediately, and it was inconsiderate." Daniel was touched by the apology, saying, "You brought me to your village, and that was help enough." Nalinai continued with her expression serious, saying, "Our mother would have been ashamed of us, and she taught us that hospitality is sacred, and a stranger who is hungry should be fed before questions are asked. And we failed in this." Daniel said, "Your mother sounds like a wise woman. And is she here? And I'd like to thank her for raising such kind daughters." Nalinai's expression grew sad, saying, "She died 2 winters ago, and a sickness took many of our people, and she and our father both fell to it." Daniel said softly, "I'm sorry, and I lost my parents too, though in a different way. And they're still alive, but they're very far away, and I may never see them again." They shared a moment of understanding as two people from different worlds, connected by loss. Kiona arrived soon after and equally laden with food, and when she saw what Nalinai had brought, she laughed, saying, "I see we had the same thought, sister." Nalinai replied with a small smile, saying, It seems we both remembered mother's teachings at the same time. Between them, they had brought enough food to feed Daniel for a week, and he did his best to eat what he could, and not wanting to seem ungrateful, but eventually had to explain again about his smaller appetite. The sisters seemed to find this endlessly fascinating, and they asked him questions about Earth and about human eating habits and about his ship and his journey, and Daniel answered as honestly as he could and described his world and his people in terms he hoped the translator could convey accurately. Kiona asked with her eyes wide, saying, "So, you travel between stars in your sky vessels, and how many days does this take?" Daniel said, "Many, many days, and with our faster-than-light drives it took us 6 months to reach this sector, and without them it would take hundreds of years." Both sisters looked awed by this, and Nalinai touched his suit gently, asking, "And this protects you?" He explained, saying, "From the cold and from harmful air and from radiation." "Yes, but the planet's air seems safe for me to breathe, so I don't need the helmet most of the time." Nalinai said seriously, "You are very brave, and to travel so far from home with only this thin covering to protect you." Daniel hadn't thought of it that way, and he supposed from their perspective it did seem rather foolhardy. A horn sounded from somewhere in the village with 3 long notes, and both sisters immediately stood. Kiona explained, saying, "The chief summons everyone to the gathering place, and he will want to meet you now." Daniel's stomach tightened with nervousness, but he nodded, saying, "I'm ready." They led him back to the communal area from the night before, and many villagers were already assembled and forming a large circle around the central fire pit, and Daniel noticed they had left a clear path from the largest dwelling to the center. Aida stood near the fire with her silver-streaked hair braided elaborately, and she nodded to Daniel as he arrived with the sisters. Then the chief emerged from the dwelling. He was enormous even by the standards of his people, and Chief Dakota stood at least 14 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a door, and his hair still fully black, despite his age, was tied back with a leather cord decorated with eagle feathers, and his face was weathered and stern and marked with ceremonial tattoos that seemed to denote rank or achievements, and he wore a cloak made from the hide of some great beast, and at his side hung a war club that looked like it could crush boulders. The crowd fell silent as he approached, and his eyes, dark and penetrating, fixed on Daniel immediately. Daniel felt like a mouse being observed by an eagle, but he forced himself to stand straight and meet the chief's gaze, and he would not show fear. Dakota walked around Daniel slowly and studied him from every angle, and the silence stretched uncomfortably, and finally he spoke with his voice deep and resonant. He said, "You are the sky traveler and the small stranger who fell from above." Daniel replied with the translator converting his words, saying, "Yes, Chief Dakota, and I am Lieutenant Daniel Carter of the Earth vessel, Wanderer, and I come in peace." Dakota repeated the word, saying, "Peace, and yet you carry weapons." He pointed at the plasma pistol on Daniel's hip. Daniel slowly removed the weapon and held it out with the butt first, saying, "A tool for protection and nothing more. And I offer no threat to your people, and I'm alone." And far from home, Dakota took the pistol and examined it with interest, and despite his large fingers he handled it carefully, asking, "This is a weapon of light and fire?" Daniel confirmed, saying, "Yes, and it fires concentrated energy, but I would never use it against you or your people, unless I had no other choice." Dakota said an honest answer, "And Aita tells me you were respectful to our children and that you ate with us peacefully, and these are good signs." Daniel said, "Your people have shown me kindness, and I would not repay that with violence." Dakota nodded slowly, and then he looked at Nalinai and Kiona, who stood nearby, and his expression softened slightly. He said, "My nieces found you, and they tell me they failed to offer you food when they first encountered you, and this troubled them greatly. Daniel said they brought me here safely, and they've more than made up for it. And this morning they both brought me food, and so much food that I couldn't possibly eat it all." This brought some laughter from the crowd, and Dakota's stern expression cracked into something that might have been amusement. He said, "It is good that they remembered their honor, and hospitality is the heart of our people, and a stranger who needs help should receive it, whether they are large or small." Turned to address the crowd, saying, "This stranger and this Daniel Carter has conducted himself with respect and courage, and he shall be welcome in our village as long as he wishes to stay, and any who offer him harm will answer to me." Relief flooded through Daniel, and he bowed deeply, saying, Thank you, Chief Dakota, and your generosity honors me. Dakota continued, turning back to Daniel, saying, There is, however, a matter we must discuss. And my nieces, in their haste to correct their error, both brought you morning food. And they competed in their hospitality, and each trying to show greater kindness than the other. Daniel wasn't sure where this was going, saying they were both very kind. Dakota said carefully, This creates a situation, and in our culture, when two unmarried people of age both offer food to a stranger with such enthusiasm, it can be interpreted as a declaration of intent. Daniel's confusion must have shown on his face because Ayita stepped forward to explain. She said gently, What the chief means is that your acceptance of food from both Nalinai and Kiona, particularly after they brought it personally to your dwelling, has created what we call a binding of interest. And in our tradition, this means they have both declared you as a potential mate. Daniel felt all the blood drain from his face, saying, Wait, what? The gathering place erupted in murmurs and whispers, and Daniel looked from Ayita to Dakota to the two sisters, who both appeared somewhere between embarrassed and defiant. Daniel said quickly, I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I didn't know that accepting food meant anything beyond well accepting food. And in my culture, when someone offers you a meal, you accept it to be polite. Dakota held up his hand for silence, and the crowd immediately quieted, saying, We understand that you did not know our customs. However, my nieces did know them. And they are both of marriageable age, and they are both without husbands, and their actions, intentional or not, have created an obligation. Daniel's voice came out higher than he intended, saying, An obligation. Ayita stepped closer, with her expression sympathetic, saying, In our tribe, when an unmarried woman brings food to an unmarried man's dwelling at dawn, particularly fresh-made food prepared with her own hands, it signals romantic interest. And when two women do this to the same man on the same morning, it indicates a competition for his favor. Daniel looked at Nalinai and Kiona, and Nalinai had her arms crossed with her jaw set stubbornly, and Kiona looked somewhat amused by the whole situation, but she wasn't denying it either. He asked them directly, Did you both know what this meant when you brought the food? Kiona spoke first, saying, I knew, and I thought you were interesting and strange. Yes, but brave and kind, and I wanted to show I could provide for you. Nalinai was quieter, saying, I also knew, and after we spoke this morning about loss and family, I felt a connection, and I thought perhaps. And she trailed off, looking away. Daniel ran his hands through his hair in a very human gesture of stress, saying, I'm honored truly, but I'm also about 2 feet tall compared to you, and I'm a different species, and this can't possibly work, Dakota said, and there was definitely amusement in his voice now, saying size is not everything, and we have had marriages between different clans where one partner was much taller than the other, and love finds a way. Daniel protested, saying, But I'm not even the same kind of being, and I'm from another world, and I breathe different air and eat different food and have different biology. Ayita observed, saying, Yet you breathe our air without difficulty, and you eat our food and find it nourishing, and you speak with us through your magical device, and the spirits sometimes bring together those who seem incompatible for a reason. A thought struck Daniel, saying, Wait, and even if this were possible, which I'm not saying it is, your customs can't require me to marry someone just because they brought me breakfast, and that's not consent, and that's not choice, and that's just tradition. Runamok Dakota's expression grew serious, saying, You misunderstand, and our tradition does not force you to marry, but it does require that you consider both women fairly and make your intentions known, and you cannot simply ignore what has happened, and to do so would dishonor them both. Daniel asked, feeling trapped. Saying so, what do I have to do? Ayita explained, saying, You must spend time with each of them and learn about them and let them learn about you. And after a suitable period, you will declare your choice, which is to court one of them or to court neither. Or, she paused meaningfully, or to court both. Daniel squeaked, saying both. Dakota said, Our people sometimes practice plural marriage, and it is not common. But when 2 women wish to share a husband and all parties agree, it is permitted. And given that Nalinai and Kiona are sisters, this would actually be seen as quite harmonious. Daniel felt like the ground was tilting beneath his feet, saying, This is insane, and yesterday I was just trying not to die in a crashed ship, and today I'm supposed to be dating 2 giant women who could crush me with their pinkies. Kiona laughed at that, saying, "I would never crush you, Danielle, and you are too entertaining." Nalinai said sharply to her sister, "This is not a joke," and then turned to Daniel, saying, "You do not have to choose either of us, and if you wish to decline both, that is your right. But you must do it properly with respect." Daniel took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. And he was in a precarious position, and he was alone on an alien world and dependent on these people for survival, and offending them could be dangerous, but leading them on would be worse. He said slowly, "Okay, and I'll do this properly, and I'll spend time with both Nalinai and Kiona, and I'll be honest with them and with myself. But I make no promises about the outcome. And is that acceptable?" Dakota looked to his nieces, and both women nodded. The chief declared, saying, "It is acceptable, and you will have until the next full moon to make your decision, and that is 28 days. And during this time, Nalinai and Kiona will each have equal opportunity to spend time with you, and at the end, you will declare your intentions before the tribe." Daniel asked, "And if I choose neither?" Dakota said simply, "Then you choose neither, and you will still be welcome in our village as a friend and guest, and there will be no shame in it provided you conduct yourself honorably during the courtship period." It was, Daniel realized, actually quite fair, and they weren't forcing him into anything, and just asking him to seriously consider an option. He never would have imagined. He said formally, "I agree to these terms." The crowd seemed satisfied with this, and people began to disperse and talked animatedly among themselves, and Daniel suspected he would be the main topic of conversation for weeks. Ayita approached him as the gathering broke up, saying, "You handled that well," and many men would have panicked or said something foolish. Daniel admitted, "I'm still panicking on the inside, and I just have better control of my face." She laughed with a warm sound, saying, "You are adaptable, and that is a valuable trait. And my advice is get to know them as people first, and forget about size and forget about species, and just talk to them and work with them and understand who they are, and the rest will either make sense or it won't." Daniel said, "That's actually good advice, and thank yous." Aita walked away. Daniel found himself standing between Nalinai and Kiona, and both women looked at him expectantly. Kiona said cheerfully, "So who would you like to spend time with?" "First," Daniel said quickly. "I thought we could start together and get to know each other in a less formal setting, and maybe you could show me around the village and help me understand your people and your ways." Both sisters seemed pleased by this diplomatic answer, and as they led him toward the residential areas of the village, Daniel couldn't help but think that his situation had gone from simply surviving to something far more complicated. But as he walked between the two towering women and listened to them point out various features of their home and argue playfully about which sites to show him, first he found himself smiling despite everything. Life, he reflected, had a way of taking unexpected turns, and the key was being brave enough to see where those turns might lead. The next several days fell into an unexpected rhythm, and Daniel spent his mornings with Nalinai and his afternoons with Kiona, though the sisters often ended up together anyway, and neither wanted to miss out on time with the strange visitor, Nalinai. He learned was the village's best tracker and hunter, and she could read signs in the dirt that Daniel couldn't even see, and she moved through the forest with impossible silence despite her size, and she was serious and thoughtful and spoke carefully, and always considered her words before she spoke. On their third morning together, she took him into the woods to check her trap lines, and Daniel watched in fascination as she examined broken twigs and disturbed earth. She explained while pointing at marks Daniel couldn't distinguish from random scratches, saying, "A prairie stalker came through here last night, and male and full-grown and hunting, and he found one of my snares and avoided it. And clever beast." Daniel asked, "How can you tell all?" That Nalinai knelt down, and even kneeling she was taller than him standing, and she traced the marks with her finger, saying, "See how deep the print is, and that tells me his size, and the spacing between prints shows his gait, and he was hunting and moving slowly and carefully. And here she pointed to a disturbed area near a tree, and he marked his territory. And male scent." Daniel leaned closer and tried to see what she saw, and Nalinai patiently pointed out detail after detail, until he began to understand the story. The forest floor told, he said, "You're an amazing teacher." She looked surprised, saying, "Am I? And I thought I was being boring, and Kiona always says I talk too much about tracking." Daniel said with a grin. Kiona doesn't appreciate the finer details, and I find it fascinating, and on my world we've lost a lot of these skills and we have technology that tracks for us. Nell and I said quietly, that seems lonely, and to never touch the earth and to never read the signs yourself. And how do you feel connected to your world? It was a profound question, and Daniel didn't have a good answer, saying, I suppose we don't, and not the way you do, and we've traded connection for convenience. Nell and I looked sad at that, saying, I hope you do not find our ways primitive. Daniel laughed, saying, primitive and Nalinai. You can track an animal in complete darkness using only your sense of smell and touch, and you can identify plants that heal and plants that poison by their leaves alone, and you can survive and thrive in this environment using only your knowledge and skill, and that's not primitive, and that's mastery. She smiled with a rare full smile that transformed her serious face, saying, thank you, Danielle, and you see things differently than others. Afternoons with Kiona were different, and where Nalinai was serious and contemplative, Kiona was energetic and playful, and she was the village's best crafter and worked with leather and beads and cloth to create both practical items and works of art. She explained one afternoon as she showed him how to soften a hide, saying, the secret to good leather work is patience, and you rush it, and the leather stays stiff, and you take your time and work it slowly, and it becomes like a second skin. She was working on a pair of moccasins, and Daniel watched her large hands move with surprising delicacy and pulled threads through tiny holes. He asked on impulse, could you make something small enough for me? Kiona's eyes lit up, saying, a challenge, and yes, I would love to try, and what do you need? Daniel admitted, my boots are wearing out and the soles are thin. And I don't suppose you could, Kiona declared. I will make you boots that will last a lifetime. And she immediately began measuring his feet and laughed at how small they were compared to her hand, saying, you could fit both feet in my palm over the next few days. Kiona worked on the boots whenever Daniel visited, and she talked constantly as she worked and told him stories about the village and about her childhood with Nalinai and about their parents. Kiona said with a grin, mother always said Nalinai got her serious side, and Nalinai thinks about everything so much, and I tell her sometimes she thinks so hard, she forgets to live. Daniel asked, and what did your mother say about you? Kiona admitted cheerfully that I talked too much and needed to think more before acting. And she was probably right, and I am always jumping into things, and like bringing you breakfast without talking to Nalinai first, and that was very much a me thing to do. He asked, do you regret it? Kiona looked at him thoughtfully with a rare moment of seriousness from her, saying no. And do you think that is foolish, and to not regret something that created such complications? Daniel said, I think it's honest, and I'm learning that honest is good. The boots, when finished, were works of art and soft leather and perfectly fitted with intricate beadwork along the sides, and they fit Daniel perfectly and were more comfortable than any boots he'd ever worn. He said, Kiona, these are incredible. She beamed with pride, saying, now you can walk our world in proper footwear and no more of that strange black material. In the evenings, Daniel often found himself at the communal fires with both sisters and other villagers, and the people had grown accustomed to him, and children would often approach to ask questions or beg for stories about the stars. One evening, a young boy named Hakan asked, is it true there are other worlds with other people on them? Daniel said yes, and thousands of worlds, and probably millions, and some with people like me, and some with people very different. Hakan asked, are we the biggest? Daniel looked around at the towering people surrounding him, saying, you're certainly the tallest I've met, but big isn't always better, and every people has their own strengths. Nalinai, who was sitting nearby, asked, what are your people's strengths? Daniel considered this, saying, we build things and complex machines and vast cities, and we're curious and always wanting to know more and to explore further, and we're adaptable, and we can survive in many different environments. Kiona observed, like you are surviving here, Daniel, said exactly like that. As the weeks passed, Daniel found himself genuinely enjoying the time with both sisters, and Nalinai taught him to read the forest and to move quietly, and to observe the world around him with new eyes, and Kiona taught him to work with his hands and to create beauty from raw materials and to find joy in the process of making things. They were so different from each other, yet both were compelling in their own ways. But he also noticed they were different with him than they were with others, and Nalinai smiled more around him and laughed more easily, and Kiona was gentler and more thoughtful, and showed a depth he suspected few others saw. He was, despite his initial shock, beginning to care for them both one evening. About 2 weeks into the courtship period, Daniel sat alone in his guest dwelling thinking, and the full moon was still 2 weeks away, and he still had no idea what he was going to decide. There was a soft knock on the wooden frame of his door, and he opened it to find Aida standing there. She asked, "May I come in?" He said, "Of course." She entered and sat down with surprising grace for someone her size, and for a long moment she said nothing, and just studied him with those wise, ancient eyes. She finally said, "You are troubled." Daniel admitted, "I'm confused, and I came here expecting to die alone on an alien world, and instead I'm being courted by 2 amazing women who, by all logic, I shouldn't even be compatible with. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do." She asked, "What does your heart tell you?" He said, "My heart says I care about them both, and my head says this is impossible." Aida nodded slowly, saying, "Let me tell you a story. And many generations ago, a woman from the mountain clans came to our village, and she was fleeing a forced marriage and sought refuge. And our chief at the time, who was a wise man named Kuruk, offered her protection. She paused and gathered her thoughts, saying the woman was different from us in many ways, and she spoke a different language and followed different customs and even looked different, and many said she could never truly become one of us. But Kuruk's son fell in love with her, and they married despite everyone saying it was impossible, and do you know what happened?" Daniel asked. "What?" She said, "They were happy, and they had children who carried the best of both peoples, and they taught us new ways of thinking and new skills, and that woman's bloodline runs through half our village now, including through Nalinai and Kiona, and her name was Ayana, and I am named for her." Daniel absorbed this saying. "So you're saying differences don't matter?" Aida said, "I'm saying that differences only matter if you let them, and yes, you are small, and yes, you are from another world, but you are also kind and brave and intelligent and respectful, and those things matter more than size." Daniel started to say, "But practically speaking," Aida interrupted gently, saying, "Practically speaking, you are thinking too much like Nalinai, and sometimes the heart knows things the head cannot understand, and sometimes you must simply choose to try even when it seems impossible." She stood to leave and then paused at the door, saying, "The full moon comes in 14 days, and you do not have to decide everything tonight, but perhaps decide one thing. And are you willing to try? And that is the only question that truly matters." After she left, Daniel lay awake for a long time and stared at the ceiling of his dwelling. Was he willing to try? The next morning, Daniel was awakened by the sound of drums, and he emerged from his dwelling to find the entire village gathering in the central area, and the atmosphere was charged with excitement. Dakota stood at the center and wore ceremonial garb Daniel hadn't seen before, and his cloak was adorned with feathers and beads, and he carried a staff carved with intricate symbols. The chief called out when he spotted him, saying, "Daniel Carter," and approached. Daniel made his way through the crowd, and was acutely aware of all the eyes upon him, and Nalinai and Kiona stood near their uncle, and both looked nervous. Dakota announced, "The elders have discussed your situation, and we have decided that before you make your choice, you should be given the chance to prove yourself worthy of either of my nieces." Daniel's stomach dropped, asking, "Prove myself?" How? Dakota explained, "Through the trial of worth. And it is traditional when a man from outside our immediate tribe wishes to court one of our women, and he must demonstrate 3 things, which are courage and skill and wisdom." Daniel said weakly, "I didn't know I was from outside your tribe." Dakota replied with the hint of a smile, "You are from outside our world, and I think that qualifies." Daniel asked, "What does the trial involve?" An elder stepped forward, and a man named Chaitan, who Daniel had seen teaching the young warriors, and he explained 3 challenges, and first, the challenge of courage, and you must face a fear and overcome it, and second, the challenge of skill, and you must demonstrate mastery of something we value, and third, the challenge of wisdom, and you must solve a problem using intelligence rather than strength. Daniel asked, "And if I fail?" Dakota said simply, "Then you have your answer, and you are not suited for this life, and you should choose neither of my nieces, but if you succeed," he smiled, "then perhaps the impossible is possible after all." Daniel looked at Nalinai and Kiona, and both women seemed conflicted, as if they wanted to protest but couldn't. He asked, "When does this trial begin?" Chaitan said, "Now." The first challenge took place at the edge of the village near a cliff face that dropped into a rushing river far below, and a rope bridge spanned the gap and connected to the opposite cliff. Chayton announced the challenge of courage, and you must cross the sky bridge. Daniel looked at the bridge and it swayed in the wind, and he could see that several of the rope supports were frayed. And for the villagers, with their size and strength crossing, it was probably easy, but for him. He said that bridge is built for people 12 feet tall and weighing 300 pounds, and I'm 6 feet and 170 pounds, and those gaps between the planks are going to be a problem. Chayton said courage is not the absence of fear, and it is acting despite fear. And if you cannot do this, say so now. Daniel approached the bridge, and up close it was even more intimidating, and the planks were spaced for the villagers' long strides and nearly 3 feet apart in places. And for him it would be like crossing a bridge made of stepping stones, suspended over a deadly drop. He looked back at the gathered crowd, and Nalinai had her hand over her mouth and looked worried, and Kiona was biting her lip, and both clearly wanted to say something but couldn't. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped onto the first plank. The bridge swayed immediately, and he grabbed the rope railings, which were positioned at shoulder height for him, and began to move forward, and each step required him to stretch almost to the point of doing splits to reach the next plank. Halfway across, a strong gust of wind hit the bridge and it swung wildly, and Daniel dropped to his knees and hugged the plank beneath him, and his heart hammered in his chest, and the river rushed far below, and he knew a fall would be fatal. Chayton called, "You can turn back, and there is no shame in knowing your limits." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and centered himself, and he thought about his training and about missions he'd completed and about challenges he'd faced, and he thought about Nalinai teaching him to track and about Kiona's patient hands crafting his boots. He stood up and continued forward. The last few planks were the worst, and one was cracked down the middle, and he had to edge around it carefully, and another swung loose when he stepped on it, and he had to jump to the next one and nearly lost his balance, but he made it. As he stepped onto solid ground on the far side, the crowd erupted in cheers, and Daniel bent over with hands on his knees and tried to catch his breath. He had to cross back, of course, and the return journey was somehow worse, knowing what to expect, but he made it. And when he stepped off the bridge, both Nalinai and Kiona rushed forward. Nalinai said that was terrifying to watch. Kiona added, "You are either very brave or very foolish." Daniel gasped. Maybe both. Dakota approached and clasped Daniel's shoulder, saying, "The first challenge is past, and rest now, and the second challenge will come tomorrow." That evening, Daniel's muscles ached from the tension of the bridge crossing, and he soaked in the hot springs the villagers used for bathing and was grateful for the warmth. Nalinai found him there, and she sat at the edge of the pool with her feet dangling in the water. She said quietly, "You did not have to do that." Daniel replied, "Yes, I did. And if I'm going to be part of your world, I need to prove I can handle it." She said, "You could be hurt or killed." He said, "I've been in danger before, and this is just a different kind of danger." Nalinai was quiet for a long moment, saying, "Kiona and I talked last night, and we told Uncle Dakota that we did not want him to make you do this trial. But he said it was necessary and that you needed to prove to yourself as much as to us that you could belong here." Daniel admitted, "He might be right, and I've been thinking of myself as a visitor and a temporary guest, but if I'm going to seriously consider staying and really staying, then I need to know I can survive in your world." Nalinai asked with her voice almost a whisper, "Do you want to stay?" Daniel looked up at her, and in the fading light, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her expression open and vulnerable, she was beautiful. He said, "Honestly, I'm starting to." The next day brought the challenge of skill, and Daniel was led to an open field where targets had been set up at various distances. Chayton said while pointing to Daniel's plasma pistol, "You carry a weapon and show us you can use it." Daniel drew the pistol, and he had trained with it extensively, but he had never fired it on this planet, and he hoped the charge pack still had enough power. The targets were large clay pots placed on posts, and Daniel took aim at the nearest one about 50 feet away and fired, and the blue bolt of plasma shot out and struck the pot dead center and shattered it. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Daniel proceeded to hit target after target and adjusted for wind and distance, and his marksmanship had always been excellent, and he didn't disappoint, and by the time he finished, every target lay in fragments. Dakota said impressive, but this is skill with a weapon of your own world. And can you demonstrate skill with one of ours? Nalinai stepped forward carrying her bow and a quiver of arrows, and she handed them to Daniel. The bow was enormous and nearly as tall as he was, and the draw weight was meant for someone with much greater strength than him. And Daniel looked at it doubtfully. He admitted, "I don't think I can even pull this back." Chaitan said then, "Adapt. And skill is not just about strength. And it is about using what you have effectively." Daniel examined the bow carefully, and he couldn't use it as designed, but perhaps. He sat down and braced the bow against his feet and used his leg strength in addition to his arms to draw the string back, and it was awkward, and he could only draw it halfway, but it was enough. He aimed at a target about 30 feet away and released, and the arrow flew true and struck the pot and cracked it. Daniel said, "Not perfect but functional." Kiona was grinning broadly, saying, "You think like a craftsperson, and when the tool is wrong for the task, you modify your approach, and that is true." Skill Dakota nodded, saying, "The second challenge is passed, and tomorrow the final test." The challenge of wisdom came the next morning, and Daniel was presented with a problem, and two families in the village were feuding over a water source, and both claimed historical rights to it, and both needed it for their crops, and the feud was growing bitter and threatened to divide the village. Dakota instructed, "Solve this dispute and do so in a way that both families will accept." Daniel spent the morning talking to both families and examining the water source and learning the history of the dispute. And the more he learned, the more complex it became, and both families had legitimate claims and both had genuine needs. By afternoon, he thought he had an answer. He called both families together at the disputed spring, and the whole village gathered to watch and curious about what the small stranger would propose. Daniel began, "I've listened to both of you, and I believe you're both right, and you both have historical claims, and you both need the water. So fighting over who owns it is pointless, and instead, you should share it." One of the family heads said bitterly, "We tried that, and they take more than their share." Daniel pointed out, "That's because there's no clear agreement on what a share is, and here's what I propose, and we measure the flow of the spring, and then we build 2 channels, and each carrying exactly half the water, and each family gets 1 channel. And the water is divided equally before it reaches either of your lands, so there can be no dispute about who's taking too much." Both families looked skeptical. Someone asked, "But who maintains the channels?" Daniel said, "You both do, and together, and once a month members of both families work together to clear and repair the channels, and that way you both have a stake in keeping the system working." Daniel spent the final day in contemplation, and he walked alone through the forest and followed the paths Nalinai had shown him, and thought about everything that had happened since he crashed on this world. He had come here expecting nothing but survival, and instead he had found a community and a purpose and something he never expected, which was the possibility of love. But love with whom, or with both? The very idea still seemed absurd, and 2 women both twice his height from an alien species, on a planet hundreds of light years from Earth, and every rational part of his mind said it was impossible. Yet here he was seriously considering it. As the sun began to set, Daniel made his way back to the village, and Aita was waiting for him outside his dwelling. She said, "The moon rises in 2 hours and the tribe will gather and you will make your choice known." Daniel said, "I know." She asked, "Have you decided?" Daniel nodded slowly, saying, "I think so, but I'm terrified I'm making the wrong choice." Aita said gently, "There is no wrong choice and only honest ones and dishonest ones, and be honest with yourself and with them, and whatever you choose will be right." As darkness fell, the village gathered in the central area, and torches were lit and cast. Dancing shadows and the full moon rose over the mountains, and enormous and bright, and painted everything in silver light. Daniel stood in the center of the circle with Nalinai on one side and Kiona on the other, and Dakota stood before them, and, resplendent in his ceremonial garb, the chief intoned, "Daniel Carter, and you have spent these weeks in courtship with my nieces, and you have passed the trial of worth, and now you must declare your intentions before the tribe and before the spirits. And what is your choice?" Daniel's mouth was dry, and he looked at Nalinai, who was serious and strong and who had taught him to see the world with new eyes, and then at Kiona, who was bright and creative, and who had taught him to find joy in creating. Beauty, He said, I have a question first, and for Nalinai and Kiona. Both women looked at him. He asked why me, and I'm small and I'm strange and I'm from another world, and you could have any man in your tribe, and why would you want me? Nalinai spoke first, with her voice quiet but clear, saying, because you see me, and not just the hunter and not just the tracker, and you see the person beneath and you listen. When I speak about things, others find boring, and you understand loss and loneliness. And because, when you look at me, I feel seen. Kiona's answer was different but equally profound, saying, because you make me think and you challenge me to be better and to create finer things and to see beyond what I thought possible. And because you laugh at my jokes and appreciate my work, and you make me feel valued for who I am and not just for what I can do. Daniel felt his eyes sting with tears, and he turned to face the assembled tribe. He said, in my culture, we have a saying which is, home is where the heart is. And I thought my home was gone and destroyed with my ship and my crew, but these past weeks I've learned that home isn't a place, and it's people and it's belonging and it's finding where you fit. He paused and gathered his courage, continued, I fit here and with your tribe and with your ways, and most of all, he turned to face the sisters with both of you. There was a collective intake of breath from the crowd. Daniel said, Nalinai, you've shown me patience and depth, and Kiona, you've shown me joy and creativity, and you're so different from each other, yet both of you complete something in me I didn't know was missing, and I can't choose between you, because I don't want to, and I want both of you. If you'll have me. He looked at Dakota, saying, I know plural marriage is rare in your tribe, and I know the situation is unusual even by your standards, but I'm asking for your blessing to court both of your nieces with the intent to marry both, if they agree. The silence stretched out, and then Nalinai and Kiona looked at each other, and some unspoken communication passed between them, and the kind only sisters can share. Kiona grinned, saying, I told you he would choose both. Nalinai protested, but she was smiling, saying, you did. Not, and you said he would choose you. Kiona said, only because I wanted to win our bet. They turned back to Daniel together, and Nalinai spoke for both of them, saying, we accept your courtship, and both of us. The tribe erupted in celebration, and drums began to beat, and people started to dance, but Daniel only had eyes for the two women before him. Dakota raised his staff for silence, saying, this is unprecedented but not without merit, and Daniel Carter has proven himself worthy, and my nieces have made their choice, and by the laws of our people and the witness of the spirits I declare this courtship valid. He turned to Daniel with a stern expression that was belied by the warmth in his eyes, saying, but know this, small warrior, and you now have twice the responsibility, and 2 wives means 2 families to provide for, and 2 hearts to cherish, and 2 sets of kin to honor. And can you handle this? Daniel straightened his shoulders, saying, I'll do my best, and that's all I can promise. Dakota agreed, a man can do no more than his best, and he smiled then fully and warmly, saying, welcome to our family, nephew. The celebration went late into the night, and Daniel danced with both Nalinai and Kiona, though dancing mostly meant them lifting him and spinning him around while he laughed, and children ran between the dancers, and elders told stories by the fire. At one point, Daniel found himself sitting between the sisters and watching the festivities. He asked them quietly, are you sure about this, and really sure, and this isn't just gratitude or novelty? Nalinai took his hand in hers, and her fingers easily engulfed his, saying, I am sure, and I have thought about little else for weeks, and you are the first person in a long time who makes me want to share my silences. Kiona took his other hand, saying, and you are the first person who appreciates both my work and my laughter, and I am sure, Daniel, and more sure than I have been about anything, Daniel admitted. I don't know how this is going to work practically, and the size difference alone. Nalinai said firmly, we will figure it out, and together, Kiona agreed, together. And in that moment, under the full moon, on an alien world, and surrounded by people who had become his family, Daniel Carter felt something he had thought lost forever, and he felt at home. The weeks following the ceremony were a whirlwind of activity, and a formal marriage in the tribe's tradition required preparation, and Daniel found himself swept up in customs and rituals he barely understood, but tried his best to honor Nalinai and Kiona took turns explaining each tradition, and often disagreed on the details and had to consult Aita for clarification. Kiona explained one morning the marriage lodge must be built by the groom with help from the bride's family. Nalinai pointed out, "But we have 2 brides, and does that mean it should be twice as large?" Daniel suggested maybe half again as large, and we'll need space for all 3 of us. But we don't need 2 separate areas. The lodge was constructed over the course of a week, with Dakota and other villagers helping Daniel with the heavy work, and it was built in the style of the other dwellings with strong wooden beams and adobe walls, but sized to accommodate the height of his future wives while still being comfortable. For him, the interior design became a collaborative project, and Nalinai wanted practical spaces for storing hunting gear and preparing game, and Kiona wanted areas for crafting with good light, and Daniel advocated for a central hearth where they could all gather together. In the end, they created something unique in a space that reflected all 3 of them. One evening, as they worked on weaving reed mats for the floor, Kiona asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. She asked Danielle, "And can your people and ours have children together?" Daniel had been wondering the same thing, and he admitted, "I don't know, and our biologies are similar but not identical. And it might be possible, or it might not. And does it matter?" To you both sisters were quiet for a moment, and then Nalinai said, "I would like children someday, but if it is not possible with you, that does not change my feelings." Kiona suggested we could adopt, and there are orphans in the tribe who need families. Daniel said slowly, "Or we could just see what happens, and my ship's medical scanner is still functional, and I could run some tests and see if we're genetically compatible. But even if we're not, there are other ways to build a family." The conversation shifted to other topics, but it marked an important moment, and they were thinking about a future together, and a real future with all its complications and possibilities. The marriage ceremony took place on the next new moon, and Daniel wore traditional clothing that Kiona had made for him and scaled down to his size, but matching the style worn by grooms of the tribe, and Nalinai and Kiona wore matching dresses of soft leather and decorated with intricate beadwork that had taken Kiona weeks to complete. The ceremony itself was beautiful and strange, and Dakota presided and called on the spirits to witness the union, and there were exchanges of gifts, and Daniel gave each sister a knife he had crafted with help from the village's metal worker, and the handles carved with symbols representing their individual strengths, and they gave him a joint gift, which was a cloak made from the softest leather and sized perfectly for him, and decorated with beadwork that told the story of their meeting there. Were ritual words spoken and promises made, and Daniel struggled with some of the longer phrases in their language, but no one seemed to mind, and the sincerity of his effort mattered more than perfect pronunciation. When it came time to seal, the marriage tradition called for a kiss, and this presented a logistical challenge given the height difference. But Nalinai solved it by lifting Daniel up while Kiona steadied them both, and the kiss was brief but meaningful, and when they pulled apart, Daniel was officially married to both of them. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, and people from neighboring villages came to witness the unusual union, and most were supportive. Though Daniel caught a few dubious looks, and he understood, because he would have been skeptical too if someone had told him this story a few months ago. On the 4th day, they moved into their new lodge together, and that first night sitting around their own hearth felt surreal to Daniel. He said aloud, "This is real, and this is actually my life now." Kiona teased, having regrets already. Daniel said firmly no, and just adjusting to the enormity of it. "And a few months ago, I was a military officer on a doomed ship, and now I'm married to 2 amazing women on an alien planet, and I'm happy, and it's a lot to process." Nalinai settled beside him, and even sitting, she was taller than him. Standing, saying, "You can still contact your people, can you not? And with your communication device." Daniel had thought about this, and his emergency beacon was still functional, and if he activated it, there was a chance another Earth ship might eventually receive the signal. But it could take years, and rescue was far from guaranteed. He said, "I could, but I'm not sure I want to. And what would I tell them? And that I'm staying here by choice, and they'd think I was suffering from isolation-induced psychosis." Kiona asked, concerned, "Would they force you to leave?" Daniel sighed. "I don't know, and maybe. And probably. And the military doesn't usually let people just resign their commission to live with aliens." Nalinai said simply, Then do not tell them and your ship crashed and you died with the others, and let them believe that it was a pragmatic solution. If a bit final, and Daniel thought about his family back on Earth and his friends, and they would mourn him, but they would move on as people did. And he had a new family now. He decided, okay, and I'll leave the beacon inactive. And as far as Earth is concerned, Daniel Carter died. In the crash of the Wanderer, Kiona said warmly. And as far as we are concerned, Daniel Carter was reborn in the village of the people months past, and Daniel settled into his new life with surprising ease, and he learned more of the language until he could understand most conversations without the translator, and he became proficient at tracking and able to accompany Nalinai on hunts and actually contribute, and he helped Kiona with her crafting and his smaller hands useful for detailed work. He also began teaching, and the children were fascinated by his stories of other worlds and his knowledge of science. And he started informal classes and explained concepts like astronomy and basic physics, using terms and examples the tribe could understand. Dakota approached him one day while he was teaching a group of children about the solar system using rocks and sticks to represent planets. The chief observed, "You are a good teacher, and the children learn much from you," Daniel replied. "They're eager students, and they ask better questions than most adults. I've taught," Dakota said. "I have a proposal, and our tribe has long relied on oral history and tradition. But what if we could record our knowledge and our stories in a way that would last beyond any one person's memory?" Daniel understood immediately, saying, "You want me to teach you writing?" Dakota asked, "Is this possible? And can our language be captured in symbols?" Daniel assured him any language can be written, and it just takes time to develop a system that works. Over the following weeks, Daniel worked with Dakota and the elders to create a writing system for the tribe's language, and it was a blend of phonetic symbols for sounds and logograms for common concepts, and inspired by both Earth writing systems and the tribe's existing symbolic art. The first document they created was the tribe's founding story, and dictated by Aita, and transcribed by Daniel with help from Nalinai and Kiona, and when it was complete, Dakota held the bark pages reverently. He said with wonder, "Our ancestors live in these marks and their words preserved forever." It was one of the proudest moments of Daniel's life. At home, he and his wives were still navigating the practicalities of their unusual relationship, and the size difference created challenges, but they approached each obstacle with humor and creativity. Furniture had to be custom built to accommodate everyone, and they developed a system of hand signals for communication. When Daniel was out of earshot, and they learned each other's rhythms and habits and the little quirks that made them individuals. Nalinai was an early riser, and often up before dawn to check trap lines, and Kiona liked to work late into the night, when her creative energy was highest, and Daniel fell somewhere in between, though he was learning to be more flexible. They had disagreements, of course, and Nalinai and Kiona sometimes bickered like any sisters, and Daniel occasionally felt overwhelmed by trying to meet both their needs, but they talked through their problems and communicated openly, and always came back to the fundamental truth, which was they cared for each other deeply. One evening, nearly a year after their marriage, Daniel was sitting outside the lodge watching the sunset, and both moons were visible and hanging low on the horizon. Nalinai emerged and sat beside him, saying, "You are quiet tonight." Daniel said, "Just thinking. And about how strange life is, and how one disaster can lead to something wonderful. And if my ship hadn't crashed, I would never have met you or Kiona, and I'd probably be dead in some other star system, or at best continuing my boring patrol route." She asked, "Do you miss your old life?" Daniel considered, this honestly saying, "Sometimes I miss the technology and the convenience, but the life and no, and I like this better, and here I'm not just a soldier following orders, and I'm a teacher and a husband and a member of a community, and I matter in a way I never did before." Kiona joined them and settled on Daniel's other side, saying, "Are you two being philosophical without me?" Nalinai said, "Just discussing fate and choices." Kiona declared, "Boring, and I have better news, and I am pregnant." The announcement was so casual that it took Daniel a moment to process, and then he jumped to his feet, saying, "What and when and how do you know?"